Hey everybody, welcome back to Gardening with ADHD. I'm here with another 10-minute dive about how I'm growing my garden. I'm using these dives to show specific decisions I've made and why I've made them so that you can get inspired for your next project. So when I decided I wanted to start a garden in 2020, I literally jumped in thinking all I needed was dirt, plants, and water. And I was wrong. I was way wrong. Now, don't misunderstand me. I mean, this is Gardening with ADHD after all. But through all of my learning over the last year, I have discovered square foot gardening, which aims to simplify the process. Today I want to take a few minutes to describe the square foot gardening method and why I've chosen it for my garden. So the first question obviously is, what is square foot gardening? It all started in the mid-1970s when a man named Mels retired from his job as an engineer. And at some point he got interested in gardening, but he didn't agree with a lot of the methods that were being used at the time. And he sought ways that he could correct them. Now the first problem, or the primary issues that he found were, first was the amount of wasted space. Typically plants were put in rows 3 feet apart, just directly into the ground, meaning there was a lot of area that was just unused. It was just in between all of the rows, and so it took up a lot more space than was required. The second problem that he had was weeding the garden. Just the amount of time that was being spent having to take care of weeds, partly because of the spacing between the rows. When you've got 3 feet between each row of plants, it's a lot of space for weeds to take up root. In addition, with the amount of fertilizer that was being recommended, that was also being placed, in the areas between the rows, it just made for more weeds and more work. Third problem he had was just the poor dirt for growing in. It was just advised to plant in the dirt that you had, and he found that most garden dirt is full of weed seeds and not enough nutrients for the regular plants. The biggest problem that he had was also just the amount of waste. Wasted space, wasted seeds, wasted fertilizer, wasted water, just the high amount of waste in everything he just had problems with. So how did he correct those problems? The first thing he found was that plants actually didn't require the same amount of space that was being advocated. He found that he could plant vegetables closer together and actually still have them be productive. In addition, he used succession planting, meaning that once he harvested one crop, he would immediately plant in that space again, thereby being able to use the space more frequently and get more harvest out of it. For weeds, he found that weeds could be controlled by actually controlling the growing environment and not using too much fertilizer. By controlling the growing environment, it's easier to spot weeds when they're small and take care of them easier. For poor dirt, he corrected that by developing what has since been called Mels Mix. Mels Mix is a combination of compost, vermiculite, and peat moss. And by providing the organic material that made for better growing, it was easier to get healthier plants. And then to reduce waste, just be it time, be it energy, be it the amount of space that's required, the process is actually a lot more enjoyable and productive. So how does square foot gardening work? Well, the first key is the raised garden beds. As you can see behind me, that's what I've chosen to go with. And he found that by using raised garden beds, instead of planting directly in the ground, he could actually control the environment for growing. In addition, you can more easily specify where you want to grow, You can build the boxes higher if you have like a bad back. And you can also more accurately plan your garden, because when you can specify the size of your garden bed, you know how many square feet you're going to have available. So I'll go into detail on my boxes more later on, but I made them the size they are to reduce the need for having to bend over, because let's face it, I'm not getting any younger. The next key is square foot gardening areas, or square foot growing areas, I should say. If you look, if you can see in my raised beds, you will see a pink string creating a grid across the bed, dividing it into 1 foot squares. Now, in square foot gardening, each plant is actually rated based on how many can be put into a single square, instead of, you know, how far apart each seed needs to be planted. This can be anywhere from 16 per square to 1 per 4 squares. The 16 per square, you'll usually see like carrots or radishes, onions. And then the 1 per 4 square is usually like squash or melons. You know, something that is just going to eat up a large amount of space. So to add those square foot areas, there's a variety of methods. As I said, in my case, I use string, and I just put screws into the wood around the sides of the garden bed, and just loop the string around that. So that was I chose that method because it was easy, it was cheap, and it was easy to either replace or remove if needed. If plants needed more room, I needed to get the grid out of the way, it wasn't hard. In addition, the string doesn't take up a lot of room anyways. But there are other methods that I've seen people use. Some people will take a wooden lattice that's built in a 1 foot square, and they'll actually use that to delineate their square feet areas. I've seen people use their irrigation system, so they'll have you know, similar to drip pipe that has holes in it for their irrigation, and so they get both their square foot marking and you know, and their irrigation system all in one. You know, basically whatever method you find works best for your situation. But like I said, I chose mine because of it being simple, inexpensive, and easy to remove or replace. The next key towards square foot gardening is Mels mix. Now, it's 1/3 each of compost, vermiculite, and peat moss. There are some alternatives to vermiculite and peat moss, but the most important is the compost. Compost is the decayed matter that contains the key nutrients that plants need to thrive. The vermiculite and peat moss, or their alternatives, are used to both retain water and also provide drainage so that the soil doesn't get too wet and actually drown your plants. Well, it seems a lot more complicated than just, you know, using the dirt in the ground. I have found that it's actually not too hard to get, because a lot of the big box home improvement stores will actually carry raised bed garden mix, which is actually pre-measured, pre-mixed, and actually a reasonable cost. I've actually used that for all of my stuff that you see in the pots, and as you'll see in my next blog, or actually if you've seen one of the blog posts already, in the smaller garden boxes, I've just used the box store mix as an alternative to the regular soil that I put into the raised beds, but I'll get into that in another video. So, why did I choose square foot gardening? Well, in the last year, I've watched a lot of different gardeners on YouTube, and I've seen different methods used. but to me it seemed like the square foot method would be the easiest for me to pay attention to. Again, gardening with ADHD. So when I'm looking over from my beds for problems with the plants, looking for weeds or any other problems or causes for concern, it's really easy for me to just look at a square and be able to compare the plants within the square to the other plants in the square. I'm not trying to hold my attention all down the line. It's just very quick, very easy to look at a single square and assess the situation. Now, while it is very early on, I'll admit I've not been overwhelmed by the layout, and I actually enjoy being out in my garden and caring for it. One other thing I want to mention is how to get started with square foot gardening. So the first key is this book right here. All New Square Foot Gardening. This is the 3rd edition of the book. Mel originally published a book in, I believe, the early 80s called Square Foot Gardening, and they've expanded and they've updated the book ever since then. There's actually a Square Foot Gardening Foundation now that tries to promote and encourage this type of gardening, and the book is actually a lot more than just the things that I talked about today. Things I talked about today are very simple, very easy to digest, but the book actually includes things like alternatives to your garden beds. How big do you make them? What are alternatives for doing your irrigation or adding trellises for vertical gardening? It's way more expanded than just how do you build a square foot garden. It has lists of all sorts of different fruits and vegetables. How much space do they require? How many do you want to plant in a square foot? So for an absolute beginner's guide to gardening, this is what I recommend right here. Obviously, I still got a lot to learn, and I'm positive that I'm going to continue to evolve my process. I'm glad that I've started with square foot gardening. So I look forward to sharing more of the progress with you. We'll come back at you next week with another dive into a topic. Let me know in the comments something that you'd like to know more about the garden that I'm growing, or if you have any specific questions that you aren't sure of. I'm happy to share anything that I've learned with you. But thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you next time.